Endure one night in my bed and walk free. The Alpha King said as the Omega changed his fate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, Elena Wright, standing at the edge of the Great Hall as moonlight spilled through high stone windows and traced long silver lines across the floor, a space measured in dozens of feet that made her feel smaller with every step she took forward, while at the far end, seated on a raised platform of dark wood and iron, sat Alpha King Caleb Blackthorne, his posture composed, his presence calm in the way a winter night is calm, not loud, not cruel, but absolute, and the silence between them felt heavier than words, heavier than judgment, heavier than the law that had brought her here. Elena's heartbeat counted seconds like a ticking clock, each one loud in her ears, each one reminding her that she was an Omega without rank, without allies, without leverage, and yet she lifted her chin not in defiance, but in resolve, because lowering it would mean surrendering something inside her that could not be reclaimed. Caleb's gaze met hers at last, steady and unreadable, and when he spoke earlier, the hall had frozen around the sound of his voice. The offer delivered not as a threat, but as a condition, clear and controlled, and even now the words lingered in the air as if etched into stone, shaping the fate of everyone who had heard them. Elena felt the weight of that condition press against her thoughts, not as fear, but as a line drawn across her life. One night standing between captivity and freedom, and she understood that this was not a test of obedience but endurance, not of the body but of the will. Around them, guards stood still, banners hung unmoving, torches burned without flicker, and the world seemed to wait for her reaction. But Elena did not rush, because rushing belonged to those who believed power lived in speed, and she had learned that power could also live in stillness. She breathed in, steady and slow, the scent of stone and night air filling her lungs, and in that breath she made a choice that no one else could see, a choice to remain herself no matter the terms placed before her. Caleb watched, not with impatience, but with a curiosity he did not acknowledge, because something in her silence resisted the order of things he had known for years, and though he sat above her by several feet, crowned by authority and law, the space between them shifted in a way that could not be measured in inches or yards. This was how the story began, not with force, not with desire, but with a bargain spoken aloud and a fate quietly set in motion, as Elena Wright stepped forward into the light, carrying nothing with her except the one thing no decree could strip away, the strength to endure and, without knowing it yet, the power to change the Alpha King's fate. Elena followed the quiet escort down a corridor that stretched nearly 100 feet, its stone walls cool to the touch and lit by lanterns spaced every several yards, their glow soft rather than harsh, as if the castle itself refused spectacle. Her footsteps were measured, not rushed, the sound of her boots echoing once and then disappearing. And with each step she reminded herself that panic would only give the night more power than it deserved. She did not look back toward the Great Hall, because the past few minutes already felt sealed. A door closed without ceremony, and ahead of her the path narrowed into something more private, more deliberate, where decisions were no longer spoken aloud. The guard stopped at a door made of dark wood reinforced with iron bands, taller than any door she had known, and when it opened, the space beyond revealed a room both vast and restrained, wide enough to fit a long table and several chairs, yet almost bare, defined by clean lines, tall windows, and the steady presence of order rather than luxury. Elena stepped inside alone, the door closing behind her with a muted sound that did not echo, and in that silence, she realized the true weight of what had been offered was not physical closeness but isolation. The removal of witnesses, the removal of the world. Moments passed, counted not by clocks but by the rise and fall of her breathing, and when Caleb Blackthorne entered, he did so without announcement, his presence registering the way a storm does before it arrives, not loud but undeniable. He kept his distance, several feet of open space between them, enough to signal control without intrusion, and his expression remained composed. His voice when he spoke calm and even, explaining the terms again. Not as a threat, but as a boundary. One night. No more, no less. And afterward her release would be honored without condition. Elena listened without interruption, her gaze steady, and something in her silence unsettled him in a way he did not name. Because most Omegas responded with fear or gratitude or anger, and she offered none of these, only attention. When he finished, he waited, expecting perhaps a plea or a question, but Elena simply nodded once, acknowledging the reality without surrendering to it. And in that moment the balance shifted by a fraction of an inch, too small to see, too subtle to command, yet real. The hours moved forward, marked by the slow travel of moonlight across the floor, and nothing happened that resembled what the castle whispered about, because the tension lived elsewhere, in the air between two people who refused to perform the roles assigned to them. Elena remained present, aware of her surroundings, of the way the room felt colder near the windows and warmer near the hearth that remained unlit. And she noticed how Caleb watched not her body but her posture, her stillness, as if searching for something he could not define. At one point he spoke of freedom as if it were a legal concept, something granted and revoked, and Elena responded quietly, not arguing, only stating that freedom also existed internally. And that statement lingered longer than either of them expected. The night did not rush, but it also did not drag, and as the sky outside began to lighten by degrees, Caleb realized that the unease in his chest was not dissatisfaction but recognition, the awareness that something had occurred without force or command. When the first hint of dawn touched the edge of the window, he stepped back, signaling the end of the agreement, and Elena understood without being told, her shoulders relaxing not in relief but completion, because she had endured exactly what was required and nothing more. As the door opened again and she was free to leave, Caleb remained where he was, watching her walk away with the same measured pace she had entered. And for the first time in years, the Alpha King questioned whether control had truly been his to give. Elena stepped out into the early morning air, the sky pale and cool, the light soft enough to make the stone courtyard look gentler than it ever had before. And as she crossed the open space measured in wide strides and long shadows, she felt the strange sensation of being unchanged and transformed at the same time. Because nothing visible had been taken from her, yet something unseen had been confirmed. A pair of sentries watched her pass, their expressions neutral but their posture subtly different, as if an unspoken order had already reached them, and she realized that her freedom was not only permitted but protected, a distinction she would have dismissed as impossible only a day earlier. She moved through the outer gates without resistance, the heavy iron opening smoothly, and when she reached the road beyond the castle grounds, a stretch of packed earth that curved away between tall trees, she paused for a moment to breathe, counting the rhythm of her steps and the sound of birds beginning their day, grounding herself in the simple proof that she was still here, still whole. Behind her, unseen yet unmistakably present, Caleb Blackthorne stood at a window high above the courtyard, his view spanning dozens of yards, watching as Elena became a smaller figure against the landscape, and the absence he felt was not loss but disruption. The sense that a familiar structure inside him had shifted by a few degrees, enough to matter. The castle stirred awake around him. Advisors gathering, schedules resuming, the machinery of rule grinding forward as it always did, yet his attention lingered on the memory of a night that had contained no spectacle and no conquest, only endurance and quiet truth. And he found himself replaying her words, not as defiance, but as clarity. When his counsel later spoke of Omegas as resources and liabilities, their language precise and efficient, Caleb listened without interruption, but something in him resisted the ease with which those categories had once fit, and he dismissed the gathering sooner than expected, retreating not to solitude but to thought. Miles away, Elena continued down the road until the castle disappeared from view. The distance measured not in miles but in the steady release of tension from her shoulders, and with each step she acknowledged that survival had not required her to become someone else, a realization that strengthened her more than any protection could have. By midday she reached a small settlement where merchants arranged goods by the foot and gallon. the ordinary rhythms of trade unfolding without regard for kings or bargains, and she moved among them unnoticed, grateful for the anonymity that allowed her to observe without being claimed. She exchanged a few quiet words with a shopkeeper, purchased bread and water, and sat on a low wooden bench to eat, the simple act grounding her further, reminding her that freedom was not dramatic but practical, lived in choices measured by need rather than fear. Back at the castle, orders quietly changed, not announced but felt. A directive passed from voice to voice that Elena Wright was not to be hindered or questioned should she appear within the territory again, and those who received it did not ask why, sensing that the explanation would not fit within familiar rules. As afternoon light warmed the stone halls, Caleb found himself standing where the night had ended, noticing how empty space could still carry meaning. And for the first time he acknowledged that fate did not always arrive through force or prophecy, but sometimes through the quiet refusal of one person to be reduced. Elena rose from the bench and continued on her way, unaware of the ripples spreading behind her, knowing only that the road ahead was hers to choose. And somewhere between those diverging paths, a connection remained, not as a claim or a bond, but as a question neither of them could forget. The following days unfolded with a subtle imbalance that Caleb Blackthorne could not correct through command or routine, because the disturbance did not originate in his court or his borders, but within the quiet spaces of his own attention, appearing when he least expected it, during measured walks across the battlements that stretched hundreds of yards, during reports delivered with flawless efficiency, during moments when silence once felt complete. He noticed it first in small details, the way he paused longer at windows, the way he listened rather than calculated, the way the name Elena Wright surfaced uninvited, not as a desire but as a reminder of something unresolved. The pack continued to function, schedules held, patrols reported by the mile and hour, grain tallies measured by the bushel, yet his authority felt momentarily distant, not weakened but questioned by his own awareness. And that awareness unsettled him more than open challenge ever could. Meanwhile, Elena moved steadily from place to place, choosing roads that curved through farmland and wooded stretches, sleeping beneath roofs when offered and beneath open sky when not, measuring distance by sore feet, and changing weather rather than maps. And in each town she passed through, she felt the lingering tension of the world she had left begin to loosen, replaced by something quieter, a confidence rooted not in safety but self-trust. One evening she stopped near a river wide enough to reflect the sky, its surface calm, and as she watched the water move without resistance, she recognized the same quality she had carried through the night in the castle, endurance without struggle, and she wondered briefly if the Alpha King had recognized it too. Back at the stronghold, whispers began to circulate, not of scandal but curiosity, because those closest to Caleb sensed a shift they could not name, an alteration in priorities, a hesitation before decisions that once came instantly, and when a senior advisor suggested tightening restrictions on Omega's traveling through the territory, Caleb declined without explanation, his voice steady, his refusal final, and the room fell silent in a way that signaled change more effectively than decree. Later, alone, he replayed the moment Elena had listened to his terms without pleading, without bargaining, and he acknowledged the truth he had resisted, that power met without fear loses some of its certainty, and that certainty had long been the foundation of his rule. Elena continued onward, trading work for meals, helping mend fences measured in feet and yards, her hands steady, her presence unremarkable, and yet she carried an inner steadiness that drew quiet respect, because people sensed when someone had faced something immense and emerged intact. On a cool afternoon she encountered a messenger on the road who recognized her name, his posture shifting subtly, respectful without explanation, and she understood then that the promise of freedom had extended farther than the castle gates, carried outward by unspoken order. At dusk that same day, Caleb stood beneath the open sky, feeling the wind move across the high ground, and for the first time he admitted that the night had altered him not through challenge but exposure, revealing the limits of command when faced with choice freely endured. He did not regret the bargain, but he could no longer pretend it had ended cleanly, because something had been left behind, not ownership or claim, but a question that followed him through corridors and councils alike. Elena reached the edge of a larger town as night settled, lanterns lighting streets measured by blocks rather than paths. And as she stepped forward, blending into a crowd that did not know her history, she felt neither pursued nor protected, only present, and somewhere miles away, beneath the same darkening sky, the Alpha King felt the unfamiliar weight of restraint, understanding at last that control lost is not always taken, but sometimes willingly set aside. Time continued its steady march, measured not by calendars but by the subtle consequences of choice. And both Elena Wright and Caleb Blackthorne began to feel those consequences in ways neither had anticipated, because the bargain that was meant to conclude in a single night had instead opened a quiet corridor between their lives that neither distance nor silence could fully close. In the larger town where Elena had settled for a time, she found work assisting an aging couple who ran a modest supply shop, shelves counted in feet rather than excess, days structured by opening hours and the rhythm of customers who valued fairness more than authority. And she discovered that her presence brought calm, not because she tried to lead, but because she listened, a habit formed long before the castle walls ever rose around her. People spoke freely around her, sharing worries about trade routes, harvest yields, and changing rules along the borders. And Elena noticed how often the Alpha King's name appeared not as fear but as certainty, a constant force assumed rather than examined. And she wondered if he had ever been seen as a man rather than a position. Miles away, Caleb confronted a different unease, one that surfaced during a review of old records detailing the origins of laws he had enforced without question, some written generations ago, others adjusted through habit rather than reason. And as he read, he found himself asking questions he had never needed before, not about power but about purpose. And that shift unsettled him more deeply than open rebellion ever could. He recalled Elena's steady gaze, the absence of resentment, the presence of choice, and he realized that she had not asked him to change, which made the impulse entirely his own. Weeks passed, and a minor dispute arose along a trade road near the town Elena occupied. Nothing dramatic, only confusion over passage rights. Yet when word reached the castle, Caleb surprised his counsel by ordering negotiation rather than enforcement, a measured response that sent a ripple of surprise through the ranks, because it mirrored the restraint he had witnessed and could no longer dismiss. Elena heard of the decision days later through casual conversation, and she felt an unexpected tightening in her chest, not concern but recognition, because restraint chosen freely carries a different weight than restraint imposed. And she understood then that the night had altered more than one path. One afternoon, as Elena organized supplies by weight and volume, a royal courier arrived, his demeanor respectful, his message brief, informing her that should she wish to travel or remain, no obstacles would be placed before her within the territory. And though the words were formal, she sensed the intent behind them, not control but acknowledgement. She thanked him without ceremony, aware that acceptance did not require submission. And after he left, she returned to her task, grounding herself in the tangible world of measures and balances. At the castle, Caleb stood alone in the council chamber long after the others had departed, the room quiet, the long table empty, and he confronted a truth he could no longer avoid, that the strength he admired in Elena was not something he could command or claim, only recognize. And that recognition demanded a re-evaluation of himself. As autumn approached, Elena prepared to move on, her work complete, her gratitude sincere, and as she packed what little she owned, she reflected on how endurance had taught her more than survival ever could, teaching her that dignity carried forward creates change without force. On the same evening, Caleb looked out across his lands, measuring distance by hills and roads rather than borders. And for the first time he understood that fate did not bind through dominance, but through the quiet alignment of choice. And somewhere between a town preparing for winter and a castle learning restraint, the unspoken connection between an Alpha King and an Omega deepened, not as a claim, but as a shared turning point neither could undo. The shift arrived quietly, without omen or spectacle, revealing itself through a convergence of moments that neither Elena Wright nor Caleb Blackthorne could ignore, because the space between their separate paths began to respond, as if something unseen had recognized them both. Elena had resumed traveling, moving north along a road measured in long miles and gradual elevation, the air cooling with each day, and she noticed an unfamiliar awareness settle into her senses, not a voice or command, but a pull towards stillness whenever she paused, as if listening mattered more than moving forward. One evening, she stopped at a small and set back from the road, its porch spanning several yards, and as she sat with a mug of warm tea, she felt a brief pressure in her chest that faded as quickly as it came, leaving behind clarity rather than fear. And she understood that whatever had been set in motion was not meant to trap her, but to attune her. At the same hour, far away beneath the stone arches of the castle, Caleb experienced a similar moment of interruption, a sudden awareness that caused him to still mid-step, his breath catching not in alarm but recognition, and he dismissed the attendants around him with a quiet gesture, choosing solitude without knowing why. He moved to a window overlooking the grounds, distances stretching outward in clean lines, and felt the same steady pressure Elena had sensed, a reminder rather than a demand, and for the first time he did not resist it. Memories surfaced unbidden, not of conquest or command, but of restraint, of endurance freely chosen, and he realized with a clarity that left him unguarded that the night had created a connection not through claim but through alignment, a resonance between choice and consequence. Elena slept lightly that night, dreams untroubled yet vivid, filled with open spaces and balanced scales. And when she woke before dawn she felt grounded, as if something within her had settled into place, and she rose with purpose, understanding that the road ahead remained hers, but that she no longer walked it entirely alone. Days later, news reached the castle of a coming council among neighboring territories, a gathering measured by influence rather than force, and Caleb surprised even himself by volunteering to attend in person, his advisors exchanging looks but offering no protest, sensing that his decision carried weight beyond explanation. As preparations began, Caleb acknowledged internally what he had not yet spoken aloud, that whatever bound him to Elena was not obligation but recognition, a mirror held up to his own potential for change, and that denying it would mean denying the future he had begun to shape. Elena learned of the council while passing through a market town, the information offered casually, yet she felt the now familiar awareness stir, guiding her not with instruction but with understanding, and she chose a route that would place her near the gathering without planning an encounter, trusting the alignment she felt rather than seeking control. As the days narrowed toward convergence, both moved with calm certainty, their choices independent yet complementary, like two paths drawn toward the same horizon without needing to cross prematurely. On the eve of the council, Caleb stood alone beneath the open sky, the stars steady overhead, and accepted fully that the change within him was irreversible, not because of power lost, but because of perspective gained, and he welcomed it. Miles away, Elena paused on a ridge overlooking the lights of the valley below, the air crisp, her breath steady, and she felt the alignment settle once more, not as destiny imposed, but as possibility unlocked, and she smiled softly, understanding at last that fate does not bind by force, but awakens when two lives choose truth over fear at the same moment. The council convened beneath a wide canopy of open sky, the gathering grounds measured in broad spans of stone and timber, delegates arriving from every direction with banners folded and voices controlled. And when Caleb Blackthorne entered the circle, the subtle shift in attention was immediate, not because of display, but because of the steadiness he carried, a presence that no longer pressed outward but held its ground. Elena Wright arrived later, blending into the edge of the assembly with the quiet confidence of someone who did not seek notice, her path guided by choice rather than summons. And when she took her place among travelers and observers, the familiar awareness settled again, not urgent, simply present. Discussions unfolded with the expected precision, matters of trade measured by miles of road and seasonal yield, agreements weighed by benefit rather than threat, and Caleb listened more than he spoke, offering clarity without dominance, a change that drew glances from those who had known him longest. As the hours passed, a question arose regarding passage for Omegas across disputed borders, framed carefully as logistics, yet weighted with old assumptions, and the circle grew still, waiting for the Alpha King's response. Caleb stood, his posture relaxed but resolute, and stated plainly that free passage would be protected within his territory without exception, not as concession but as principle, his words measured and complete, leaving no room for negotiation, and the decision landed not with force but finality. Murmurs followed, some surprised, some thoughtful, and across the circle Elena felt the alignment sharpen into recognition, understanding that this was not performed for her yet reflected what she had endured and shown. A representative challenged the stance with polite concern, and Caleb responded without raising his voice, explaining that authority strengthened by fairness endures longer than authority enforced by fear, and as he spoke, his gaze lifted briefly and met Elena's, not as claim but acknowledgement, a moment that passed without spectacle, yet carried weight beyond the circle. Elena did not bow or avert her eyes. She simply inclined her head in return, a quiet exchange that neither invited nor denied, and the air between them steadied as if a balance had been set. The council moved on, agreements recorded, distances mapped, and when it concluded, the gathering dispersed in orderly fashion, conversations continuing in measured tones, the day settling into afternoon light. Afterward, Caleb stepped aside to speak with advisors, their questions careful, their respect evident, and he answered them with transparency rather than command, a choice that affirmed his direction without explanation. Elena prepared to leave the grounds, her purpose fulfilled without agenda, when a courier approached to offer escort should she desire it, and she declined politely, appreciating the offer while choosing her own path, and the courier accepted the refusal without resistance, a small but telling sign of change. As Elena walked away, the awareness eased into calm, no longer pulling, simply present, and she felt neither bound nor distant, only certain that what had been set in motion continued beyond proximity. Caleb watched her departure from a respectful distance, not following, not calling her back, understanding that recognition does not require possession, and as the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the stone, he acknowledged privately that the greatest shift had not been the council's decision, but his own willingness to be seen choosing differently. Elena reached the road beyond the gathering, the terrain opening before her, and she felt steady, affirmed not by proclamation but by the quiet truth that endurance had led to acknowledgement without demand. Behind her, the Alpha King returned to his duties with a lighter step, knowing that the path forward would be measured not by control but by the integrity of choices made in clear daylight, and between them, without promise or declaration, the alignment held, strong precisely because it remained free. The days following the council unfolded with a steadiness that felt earned rather than imposed, and both Elena Wright and Caleb Blackthorne moved through their respective worlds with a shared sense of quiet recalibration, as if the balance they had touched now extended outward into ordinary life. Elena traveled eastward along a road bordered by low hills and open fields, stopping where work was offered and leaving when it was complete, her presence leaving behind small impressions of reliability and calm, because she did not attempt to persuade or correct. She simply showed up fully, and people responded to that without needing explanation. She found herself welcomed more easily than before, not because her past was known, but because her manner carried assurance without arrogance, and she understood that dignity once recognized does not vanish when no one is watching. Back at the castle, Caleb implemented changes gradually, not announced as reform but practiced as consistency, adjusting how disputes were handled, how petitions were heard, how omegas were addressed in formal proceedings, and those around him adapted because the changes were coherent, grounded in principle rather than impulse. Some questioned the shift quietly, others approved openly, yet none could deny that stability increased, measured not in obedience but in cooperation. And Caleb observed these outcomes with attentive patience, noting how authority exercised with restraint invited participation rather than resistance. One evening, while reviewing reports by lamplight measured in slow-burning hours, he paused at a familiar name mentioned incidentally in a travel log. Elena Wright noted as passing safely through a border station without delay, and he felt the now familiar awareness settle, not sharp, not demanding, simply present, a confirmation rather than a pull. He set the report aside, understanding that her safety mattered not because it was his responsibility, but because it reflected the world he was choosing to shape. Elena sensed the alignment again while crossing a river at sunset, the water shallow enough to wade, the current steady. And as she stepped onto the far bank, she felt a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, not in relation to anyone else, but in relation to herself. She reflected on how the night she had endured no longer defined her by hardship, but by clarity, because it had stripped away illusion without taking anything essential, and she recognized that freedom sustained itself through continued choice. As autumn deepened, messages circulated through the territory, subtle but consistent, reinforcing protections and pathways, and Elena encountered fewer barriers, fewer assumptions, her rank less relevant than her conduct. And she understood that systemic change often announces itself through absence rather than proclamation. Caleb observed the same phenomenon from another vantage point, noticing how fewer conflicts escalated, how councils resolved more efficiently, how trust reduced the need for oversight. And he acknowledged privately that the most profound influence Elena had exerted was not through presence, but through example, a reminder that endurance aligned with integrity alters outcomes. Late one afternoon, as the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the training grounds measured in long strides, Caleb stood watching the horizon, reflecting on the fact that he had not sought Elena out again, and that this restraint felt correct, because recognition did not require repetition to remain real. Elena, settling for the night in a small village, shared a meal with strangers who treated her with simple courtesy, and she felt no urge to speak of her past, because it no longer needed defense or validation. The alignment between them held without tension, like a steady line drawn through both their lives, not binding them together, but orienting them toward a future shaped by conscious choice. And as night fell across the land, castle lights and village lanterns glowing miles apart beneath the same sky, both understood that what had been acknowledged did not demand possession, only continuation, a shared commitment to live the truth they had recognized when endurance met authority, and neither turned away. The season turned with quiet certainty, leaves thinning on the trees and air sharpening along the roads. And both Elena Wright and Caleb Blackthorne found themselves standing at thresholds shaped not by decree, but by understanding, because the alignment that had guided them now asked for acknowledgement without demand. Elena paused at the edge of a wide plain where paths diverged by miles, the horizon open and unclaimed, and she felt no urgency to choose quickly, only confidence that whichever road she took would be hers by intention, not reaction. She reflected on how endurance had taught her to remain present under pressure and how presence had revealed truth without confrontation, and she understood that freedom lived not in distance from the past, but in clarity about it. At the castle, Caleb stood in the high gallery overlooking the valley, the view stretching far enough to dissolve borders into terrain, and he considered the sum of changes that had taken root, noticing how his decisions now aligned with principle rather than habit, how restraint had strengthened authority rather than diluted it. Reports arrived with steady regularity, measured by hours and days, and among them were quiet confirmations that Elena traveled safely, that policies held, that cooperation replaced coercion, and he felt neither pride nor ownership in these outcomes, only responsibility honored. One evening, as dusk settled and the sky deepened into blue, Caleb issued a simple directive to his court, not recorded as law but carried by practice, that any who had endured injustice would be met first with listening, a standard that required no spectacle yet demanded consistency. And as it took effect, he recognized it as the true mark of leadership he had been searching for. Elena sensed the alignment ease into completion as she walked beneath the first stars, the familiar awareness now calm and settled, no longer guiding or pulling, simply affirming, and she smiled softly, understanding that some connections exist to awaken choice, not to claim outcome. She thought of the Alpha King without longing or distance, acknowledging him as a catalyst rather than a destination, and she felt gratitude without obligation, a balance she had earned. Weeks later, word reached the outer settlements of continued stability, of measured governance, of a ruler who listened. And Elena heard these accounts with quiet recognition, knowing that change sustained itself through daily action rather than singular moments. At the same time, Caleb acknowledged privately that he no longer sought certainty through dominance, because he had learned that certainty grounded in integrity endures beyond command, and he accepted that this lesson had arrived through endurance freely chosen by another. As winter approached, both prepared for what came next without anticipation or fear, Elena choosing her work and shelter with care, Caleb shaping policy with patience, each grounded in the knowledge that their paths had intersected to reveal something essential and then diverged by design. One clear night, Caleb looked out across the land and understood fully that the bargain he had offered had not ended at dawn, because it had reshaped him, and he accepted that transformation as his own responsibility. Miles away, Elena stood beneath the same sky, the stars steady overhead, and she acknowledged that she had survived one night not to be defined by it, but to claim her future, and in the quiet space between their lives, without promise or return, fate rested, changed by choice, complete because it remained free.